Hello, everybody. Welcome. Webinar time. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I am Chris Irons, and I run a company called Strata www.stratasolve.com.au, Strata Consultancy. Alongside me, virtually, as always, Frank Higginson, partner, Hines Legal, hineslegal.com.au, industry expert. Frank, hello.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone. Again.
Thanks, everybody. Just a bit of housekeeping, as per always. If you are new to the show, we live stream to YouTube and Facebook every Thursday at 2 p.m. Brisbane time. So to follow on Facebook, you go to the Hines Legal page and hit the like button there. And icon, and if it's YouTube, you go to the subscribe button and the notification bell. We welcome comments live, keeps us on our toes, and it also helps other people as well. So don't be afraid to do it either live or later. If your comment is a bit more involved, though, please use the link that has just now appeared in chat for those more involved queries, and we will get back to you. Today, I think it's fair to say, Frank, one of our favourites. Yeah, one of our favourites. So Frank and I, if you've ever watched one of these or heard one of us speak, you know that we are firmly of the belief that strata and politics are the same beast, Frank?
Yeah, just on a much smaller scale, and we both really enjoy talking about what we're talking about today. So this isn't really a chore as much as it's one of the conversations that we've had repeatedly over the years. So yeah, but it is. It's a contest of ideas.
It very much is.
Politics, in theory, should be about, and in strata, they're just different ideas related to your strata scheme. And it's the communication of those and the voting around those that becomes really interesting, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and we're going to cover two topics that get thrown. I know I get thrown these topics pretty regularly, and I hear about them. I'm assuming you do as well, Frank. And this is the idea of factions and block voting. Those two terms are bandied about a lot. We're going to try and briefly deconstruct what that actually means, particularly in strata, and try and take a bit of an overview of it all. And of course, the country is heading to an election. Who the hell knows is going to win that one? So it's topical. And I think the more and more the election happens and we get to sort of outcomes and whatever happens afterwards, those similarities to strata will actually start to become more and more obvious, I'd argue. I think it's fair to say, Frank, we hear about factions and voting blocks in particularly negative context, don't we?
Yeah, well, it's very rare for someone to ring us and say, just let you know that I got what I wanted. It's normally people contacting either of us in different capacities about I didn't get what I want, or they're getting what they want, and it's because factions, voting blocks, whatever it might be. And we did a webinar a little while ago about appointment of administrators, which we'll put up a link to later on. And it's one of those things that usually part two of that conversation for me is I want to appoint an administrator to take on this particular decision. And I suppose if you're really keen on that, you can press the link to look at that full webinar about whether administrators are easily appointed or not, and they're not, just quietly. But yeah, it is unhappiness with the outcome. And part of it, I suppose, Chris, is then the why. Maybe the means to the end is the faction or the block that has voted it down, but people might be voting for particular reasons or otherwise. And I suppose today is really talking about what you and I probably think that means in a strata context. What is a faction in a strata context? How does it work?
Yeah, let's delve. We'll kick it off with factions, I think. Factions, I think people will be very familiar with that term in politics. Some people would tend to associate factions far more with one side of politics than the other, I would suggest. But I think really, Frank, doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, there's factions regardless.
Everywhere. Yep.
Everywhere. And it's usually one of three, isn't it? Left, right, centre. Can you be a centre faction? I guess you can, can't you?
You're parked in the middle somewhere. I think you can have wets and dries, moderates. You can call them any number of things, I suppose. But probably what it certainly connotes is a group of people working in concert together. And I suppose in a political sense, that might be because they all, I'm going to align with this particular group of people, and my personal purpose at some stage is to become an elected member of parliament, or otherwise. I don't think Strata is probably quite as higher intentional, if that's the right phrase, as that, but it's more sort of working with like-minded people.
Yeah. We had to go at trying to find a definition here, and we eventually ended up with the Oxford Dictionary, good old Oxford. Defines faction as a small group of people within a larger one whose members have some different aims and beliefs to those of the larger group. There's a few critical points in that definition. So you've got the smaller subset of the larger and the differing beliefs and aims to the larger group. So we translate that to Strata. So you might think of it then in terms of factions, therefore, on the committee. I think that's the one where we hear it most commonly, Frank, factions on a committee. And factions in the broader body corporate. When there's factions in the broader body corporate, particularly in a very large scheme, things can get out of hand really quickly under those circumstances. Other factions, though, you might have, when it comes to factions in Strata, you might, Frank, have it the case where people are aligned to the caretaker. And there are usually a lot of very sound reasons why that might happen, particularly if that caretaker is also letting. So aligned for very commercial reasons. They might be aligned to a body corporate manager. And Frank, that's more a personality thing, isn't it?
I think so, yeah, as opposed to sort of ideologically left or right in a sense of political positions. It is more a relationship thing. And I know even from a lawyer's perspective, it's we and it happens. So you go under the bus where we're acting for a body corporate for an extended period of time. Obviously, when you're acting for a body corporate, usually in our sense, it's not because everyone's happy. There was a particularly emotive issue that was up before the body corporate or continually running with the body corporate. For that first committee, we're doing what we had to do. The opponents, call it the faction to the other side, rolled that committee, and then the first thing they did was execute us. We're changing lawyers. Okay, you know what I mean? It just happens. And I think it's probably one big difference in Strata is that in politics, I think it's pretty rare for someone in a political party not to be part of some faction somewhere. In Strata, particularly at owner level or general meeting level, it is far from uncommon for there to be a significant number of people who don't care one way or the other. So don't bother voting, whatever. I mean, and really, subject to how big your scheme is and all that sort of stuff, if you've got a 50% rate of people being interested in the affairs of your particular body corporate, I'd say you're well and truly above average. So the factions in Strata, as you say, mate, are usually tucked into committee levels, 4-3, whatever it might be, 2-2-3, 4-1, whatever. And it's rarer to see them at general meeting level as much as it does happen.
That's right. And don't forget also that when we talk about factions like that, then if you've got those factions, then chances are you've also got factions which are in complete opposition. So if you've got a faction that's aligned to the caretaker, chances are there's another faction that's bitterly opposed to the caretaker, and so on, and so on. Okay, so let's ask this question, Frank. Can factions be a good thing?
Yes. So like my 13-year-old daughter answering a loaded question. Well, I suppose then it's all about the intentions, isn't it? You know what I mean? So, and this becomes a very subjective thing then. So what are the intentions, or what's the belief system, if we're talking about, and you go back to the definition we were talking about before, what do these people actually want? Is it to install themselves as committee members on the basis that they all get paid 20 grand a year to perform committee functions? I mean, that might not be the noblest of intention. Is it to deal with the leaking roof that has been on the building for the last 12 years and previous committees have ignored? That doesn't affect any of them because they're not in there. They just think they've got a statutory obligation to do what they've got to do with respect to the body corporate. So yes, for the right purposes, I think, and actually probably creating, and particularly in those sort of, what do you call them, dysfunctional style schemes, someone grabbing a scheme by the scruff of the neck and making things happen the way they should be is a good thing, because it's lots of them don't.
You can actually, a faction can be a way of getting other owners engaged where they previously weren't too. And I think your point is a well-made one there, Frank, where a faction is galvanised to achieve an outcome that's been lacking for some time, for whatever reason. That's where that kind of coterie, if you like, of people coming together for a purpose can be a really good thing. Terry has commented, thanks, Terry. We have a faction in our complex, self-interest and vindictive. And I guess that leads us nicely, Terry, your comment, into the cons side of things. Let's go through those cons, Frank. Look, at their absolute worst, a faction can destroy the fabric of that community, can't it?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, things can become really dysfunctional. And I suppose if you get that self-interest element, you get that vindictiveness, you get attacks against people, you get pressure not to comment. And certainly, again, inside a body corporate context, people inside political parties tend to stand up for what they particularly believe in. And they've certainly got aligned groups. In a bad way, factions in a strata context can really shut down dissenting votes or people that might otherwise be interested, because, you know, a lot of owners own their unit, and that's fine. But the moment they start feeling attacked or under pressure, it's very easy to go back into your shell and not get involved in any way, shape or form in the affairs of the body corporate. And that's not a good thing. That certainly allows the people that are in charge to retain control and stand over people and bully them into submissions and quietness. But that's not a good thing in a strata context. And that's, I suppose, leadership 101, isn't it?
Absolutely, Frank. And I think at its absolute worst, factions can lead us to a point where things are deadlocked at the scheme and just don't get done. And we've each seen plenty of instances of schemes where very few things get completed or get completed in a timely fashion because the factions are locked in battle.
And some of those things that don't get completed are the opposition's ideas or wishes or whatever it might be. So it really does, you know, in theory, when you're on a committee, you should rise above those sort of petty behaviours type thing. But, and this is the difficulty with strata law, they talk about it as being the fourth level of government, but there is very little accountability for performance. You know, I suppose we've got our state, local and federal members constantly have the media on their backs and all the rest of it. Not really, doesn't really happen in a body corporate sense.
Well, in very few cases anyway. And look, at its absolute worst, the impact of a faction can be diminished property values. And that's the ultimate price that you pay. Think of it this way. You've got a faction whose intentions are not great, or who are not executing those intentions terribly well as that faction, causing the building to be in disrepair, maintenance not being done, bad reputation. That's an impact on property values at that point.
And mate, I'd say once I could put my hand on my heart and say I've seen what I would have thought was a specific intention to drive down property prices to allow the people in control to buy them cheaper. Once. So that has been thrown at me more than once. Once I think I've probably objectively looked at it and thought, that can be their only intention.
Interesting. That's probably a discussion for another time, that one, Frank, actually.
Yep.
Really good question there. Thanks, Guy. And we will actually get to that one because I think that raises some tough issues, but we will get to that. We're going to move on to block voting. And actually, it's interesting, block here is spelt either BLOC or BLOCK. I think the first one, the BLOC, stems from the Cold War, where you had the Soviet bloc. So all of the countries that were aligned, whether they liked it or not, to Mother Russia. And that used to be called, I think that's where it comes from. And certainly all the research that we did on this one, Frank, suggests it's one of the two ways, whereas block with the K, I think, is the much more literal a block, a group, a collection. So again, we went to the good old Oxford Dictionary on this one, and it has some similarities to a faction, but it's not exactly the same. So Oxford Dictionary talks about block voting as a vote proportional in power to the number of people a delegate represents, used particularly at a trade union conference. Interesting. That was very specific, that definition. I think, Frank, so you think about that politically, you have a delegate of a specific union who fronts up to the national conference, and their vote is based upon, their vote reflects
the number of members in their union or whatever it might be. So I've got 15 votes at this particular conference and you've only got 6, mate. So yeah, absolutely. So, and that's probably then, in a sense, the votes they're carrying, they're representative of all of those members. So I suppose they're the factional head would probably be the way to put it. Now, I think probably this isn't quite the same as sorry, that's not quite the same as what you see at Strata, because Strata, and even more so with the recent last year's 2 years ago regulations, 2020, wasn't it? I'm flat out remembering what day of the week it is, and let alone what year it is at the moment. It's extraordinary. But one of the things they are very keen on in Strata is making sure that people, one vote per person. So, and there's been a bunch of watering down. I'll just cover this for a second because I think it's really important, because I think from a factional perspective, those things exist. People can get together. They can work together in concert to go stand for committee, to lobby to people. We'll talk about lobbying in a minute, guys, you've raised. But when it comes to actually physically voting, it's really, really hard for one person to represent a number of other people from a pure voting perspective in Strata. The government has always been pretty keen on people exercising their own voting rights. Now, I suppose there's some carve-outs here. If you're under Bugta, they've never caught up. So, and Chris, even before your time, even when I was a little whippersnapper starting out, used to be the proxy wars in Bugta schemes where people would go and collect proxies, indefinite proxies, and sit on them and exercise voting control for any number of years. Now, you can't use proxies under BCCM Act for lots of things. You can only use them for certain purposes. You're capped at, I think, 5% of the number of lots in the scheme of the proxies you can hold, and they've capped on POAs as well, and the powers of attorney, I should say. And I think probably the other thing now is that people are allowed to electronically vote.
Yep.
Assuming the body corporate's resolved to allow that to happen. So there's a bunch of different ways for people to have their views heard in terms of voting in a Strata context that wouldn't have been there 10 years ago. Now, I suppose it limits in terms of the electronic stuff. And also, it's slightly different from that trade union type perspective where one person speaks for a number of other people automatically because that's the factional rules. The 14 voters that but the 14 votes that might go with that factional head don't go along to the conference and say, well, I'm this way, that way, and whatever from the floor. One person does it, and that's their individual rules. But having said all of that, we still get block voting accusations as well, don't we?
Yeah, and it's usually in the context of the allegation that you've got one person who is persuasive. Sometimes it's a couple of people, but usually it's one person who is particularly persuasive, or in some cases it's suggested they're not so much persuasive as they are intimidating or bullying, for that matter. And they use that particular influence to persuade people to vote in the way that they want. The difference, I suppose, to factions, Frank, and you touched upon this just then, is that the block voting concept kind of tends to suggest that the person isn't engaged in the outcome too much, and they're just going along with it due to the force of the personality of the person. All well and good. I personally think it's pretty dangerous to assume that people aren't thinking about that sort of thing. It's a bit patronising as well. I guess it's also that situation where it gets a bit confusing. Again, you touched upon this, Frank, with things like harvesting or farming of votes. I think they're all useful descriptors, but at the end of the day, what you're talking about is a process by which one or a couple of people are trying to persuade or bring people along in the same
get people on their particular bus.
Yes, absolutely. Ultimately, that's about lobbying, and we have touched upon that in the previous webinar. and we're going to touch upon it again shortly, not in too much detail, but sort of relevant to what we're talking about there. Getting a lot of questions as well. We will get to all of those because there's some good points raised there. Quickly, Frank, do we think there could be anything positive about block voting?
Well, mate, it's the same as what we're talking about with factions. I think it comes back to noble intentions or otherwise. If it's all about getting your particular way, absolutely. And I suppose part of the difficulty in these things is that the decisions that go up in front of a body corporate sometimes might not be earth-shattering in terms of the changes to the scheme or otherwise, but they can be particularly emotional. Come down to colour scheme changes. Are we doing the off-white, the beige, the bone, the cream, or the china? Like those can be really, really divisive things. So in that sense, it's not voting me and my mates on because we can all get 20 grand a year to be committee members. It's, I like the china look and you like the beige, but that's too yellow for me. So I'm going to go really hard to make sure everyone votes china. So it's sort of, again, contest of ideas. The idea in this one is which colour scheme we're actually going with. So it can be good, but also can be bad. It might be to vote down the special levy that's required to fix the roof, which is ignoring the body corporate statutory obligations. In that sense, then it's going to be bad. So,
Frank.
yeah. And, sorry, mate, you go.
No, I was just going to say, when we talk about practical implications, I mean, we just talked about a little bit there. It happens both in big and small buildings, so don't sit there thinking, oh, this is just for big buildings. Nope. No, it happens in all. Don't forget that block and factional voting can actually be a sign of a reasonably engaged and healthy building. That contest of ideas is actually not a bad thing, depending upon what the contest is about. But it's where the factions or the block create decision paralysis, I think, where things are particularly bad, and something needs to be done about that. For an owner, and some of the queries that we're getting touched upon this today, that's a huge risk to your investment, and for the committee and for contractors, makes the job next to impossible, we would have thought. And then, Frank, I guess if at the end of the day, faction, block, do you want to change things? It comes down to lobbying, doesn't it?
It does. It absolutely does. And this is, I suppose, starting where we're getting with the questions and all that sort of thing, is you're well and truly entitled. Like, we don't live in Stalinist Russia. Everyone is entitled to put their point of view forward to everyone else. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And that's one of the things I think we touch upon this a little bit too in terms of town hall type things. When you're coming from a committee side of things, there's no reason to leave communication about particular issues, and this applies equally to owners putting forward their own motions, to the night or the day of the general meeting itself. If you're looking at an AGM, you put your motions in before the end of the body corporate's financial year, there's usually a 3-month window from there to the date the meeting's actually going to be held. So there is plenty of time to communicate with everyone around what is going on. And this is, I suppose, the factional, the block voting piece that most people ring us and are unhappy about, is they haven't actually got what they wanted out of the outcome because the person who's on the other side of the coin probably has lobbied, communicated, educated their potential voters in a different way to you. And you don't have to leave it to the end.
And I think, Frank, there is this misguided, at times, concept of Strata that it should be a gentleman's game of tennis on the lawn.
That's in the legislation, isn't it?
It's not. I've certainly encountered that mindset, and I'm sure you have too, Frank, where people think, oh, no, we can't get involved in that sort of stuff. I won't do that. You've got to be prepared to know how far you'll go to protect your investment, how far legally you will go to protect your investment. One of the takeaways that we're going to leave people on our show notes today is just how dirty are you willing to get your hands in this situation. Put it this way, if your lot is worth $750,000 and you can see things going on in your strata scheme that have the potential to reduce that value, you have to ask yourself, am I prepared to get involved for lobbying to get that around the way that we want to do? And Frankie, you said it yourself, you don't do it on the night. It's probably way too late by that point. You do it well in advance. I literally just this week was involved for a client to lobby for an outcome. it passed yesterday. We did not leave it until the night of the vote.
No.
Put it that way. And again, this is work that you and I both do, Frank, in different ways, different techniques, different strategies. But don't be afraid to bring in a third party who can wear the black hat if that's what you need.
Behind the scenes or otherwise.
Yeah,
absolutely.
There it is. We have a raft of questions there. Let's try and get into a few before we finish up because we're running out of time. From Guy, just want to ask about who can lobby and what would be considered crossing the line, and in relation to owner, caretaker, body, corporate manager can do when lobbying other owners to vote. I personally sent a video to owners with my opinion on who I wanted as caretaker to be appointed to the committee. Is this illegal? There's a slightly different standard, Frank, isn't there, for a caretaking service contractor and a body corporate manager than there is for an owner.
The Code of Conduct talks about caretaking service contractors and body corporate. Well, let's talk about caretaking service contractors not lobbying, I think, unfairly. I'll Google this up. So, and to my
here, Frank, actually,
unfairly, is that the word?
A letting agent must not engage in unconscionable conduct in conducting the letting agent business under the letting agent's authorisation. Examples: 1 or 2, exerting undue influence or using unfair tactics against the body corporate.
Yeah. So what is unfair? What is undue influence? What is acting unconscionably? It's those things, and to my knowledge, those things have never been tested. So I suppose the rule of thumb for me for that is remain factual. You're entitled to an opinion. So I think vote for Chris because I think he's a really good guy is 100% okay. Vote against Chris because he's been convicted of trust account fraud when that's actually not true is absolutely crossing the line. And obviously it's a whole bunch of grey in the middle, but you're entitled to your opinion and you're entitled to put that forward, as everyone is. So I made a video about saying this is who I think you should vote for, or this is who I'm, even better, this is who I'm voting for and this is why. I don't think that can be criticised.
A good rule of thumb, Guy, would be if the shoe was on the other foot and you were seeing that video, would you feel okay about it? I think if the answer is no, then you might think that you've crossed the line on that occasion. A few other questions. Bryce, thanks very much. Factions, must a quorum be achieved before a proxy from the Secretary or Treasurer can be approved?
Well, again, this is the joy of keeping us on our toes. I'd like to check that. But for me, I think any approval of a proxy at committee level must be by the committee. So if you haven't got a quorum, it's very hard to have a committee make a decision to approve something because the committee at that point in time is not capable of making a decision because the requisite number of committee members is not actually there.
I like that would be my take. Frank. Yep, like that logic flow. Gareth, thanks very much. To keep a faction alive, is a committee member permitted to resign and have another member of their faction take up their committee position without prior approval of the body corporate or a general meeting? Yes. In a word?
Yep. So when a committee member resigns, the committee's got to replace that. How they replace that's up to them, and that's their decision. So, and mate, you're right. Usually, what happens is it is absolutely someone from the same group. If there are factions, you'd almost look at it like a Senate. We'll go back to the politics. When a senator resigns, they're replaced by a member of the same party from that state.
And none of those parties have ever manipulated that system ever for their outcomes. Julia, as always, Julia, thanks very much. What good proxies when the committee has to approve the use of proxy, which they won't do if you are not from their faction?
I think at committee level or general meeting level, I mean, the two different things. Proxies at general meeting level are there as of right, provided there hasn't been a special resolution to prohibit their use. And then at committee level, I suppose, committee's got to act reasonably. So my question would be, what's the basis for refusal of the proxy?
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to.
I don't understand what the basis for saying no to someone appointing someone else to be there for them because they can't get there. I've got COVID, I can't come, so I'm appointing Julia. I think that's pretty hard to say no in those circumstances.
Yeah. We are quickly running out of time, so we'll rip through these last few, Frank. From Sam, thanks, Sam. Very good topic. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
How do you get committee to do the right thing when you know them and the on-site manager are in the wrong? I've tried and had conciliation with no result. Adjudication next. Yeah, frankly, Sam, unless you can find a way to negotiate or mediate or try and get some kind of settlement in the interim. But yes, that's it, frankly. Thurston, again, thanks. I'd like to discuss the reality and practical response to defamation. We haven't done one of those, haven't we, Frank?
I don't know. And to the extent that we did, it would have been under the old defamation laws, not the new ones. But I suppose if anyone wants that's a topic, mate, for sure. But if anyone wants one of the key reasons why you shouldn't pursue a defamation proceeding, just Google Ben Roberts-Smith.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Bryce, again, thank you. Is tyranny of the majority arguable?
I'll put a different word in there, Bryce, and I'll say oppression of the minority. I'll turn it around and call it the other thing. And yes, it is. There hasn't come up. Haven't really had the right. Well, actually, to be honest, we've had a couple of them that would have worked, but then they end up sorting themselves out. So oppression of the minority, as much as there's nothing in Strata law or the BCCM legislation about that specifically, very much believe that that's possible.
It's turned up in at least one adjudication order I'm aware of. Very, very quickly, Sam, lobbying doesn't work when the letting agent knows the rental pool people longer and sways their vote. Maybe, Sam, but it's not impossible by any means. I've seen it happen. I've been involved. And finally, David, thank you. Doesn't the BCCM encourage block voting through layered schemes? The rep acts as a block voter. It's actually a reasonably good way of thinking of it.
That is an excellent. That is an excellent example. Thank you, David.
Yeah,
so yes,
I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah, no, thank you.
No, you call for a poll. There you are. There's your block voting, isn't it?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We've well and truly come to the end. Gosh, there's a lot of questions there today. This is clearly something people want to hear a bit more about, and we've got a few new topics to come out of that one too. So just a reminder, everybody, if you're new to the show, we live stream to YouTube and Facebook every Thursday at 2 Brisbane time. So to follow us on Facebook, go to Hines Legal and hit the like button and icon for YouTube, hit the subscribe button and get a notification bell. Frank, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This won't be the last one of these we do.
No, it's a political world these days, so stay tuned for a bit more. And again, everybody, thanks very much for tuning in. Greatly appreciate it.
Done.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.